Hi, my name is Mark Biernat. I'm a monetary economist, and in this video, I want to talk about the Russian ruble. There's 100 rubles. And its relationship to, or connection to, the Jonny Reb dollar, the grayback, or the Confederate dollar. It's a thought experiment. There's more to the story than just saying the ruble's going down and the Confederate currency went down. There's interesting parallels, uncanny parallels, not just in a monetary realm, but in geopolitical, on the front lines, and in the economic realm that make these parallels worthy of exploration. So historical ideas. A little about myself. I originally wanted to study history. I went to school down south because I was kind of I was a Civil War buff. And I also wanted to minor in maybe philosophy. My parents flipped out, so I cheated. I majored in economics, which is kind of a hybrid of economics, of philosophy and history. And specifically, I study the history of monetary ideas. So when I was studying history of economic thought, one of the ideas that came up was this devaluation of the currency was very significant in the Confederacy, and Confederate dollars, you could probably still buy some as novelty items, parallel that of the Russian ruble today. The Confederacy was 1861 to 1865, and the relevant years of this geopolitical event is 2022. You can make an argument before that, but you also can make an argument the Confederacy was relevant before that, those times, 2022 to 2024. If we take a parallel timeline, that's about 1863 in the Confederate timeline, parallel history. So let's take a look at this thought experiment. We're going to take a look at the monetary, the currency, and there's a difference. We're going to take a look at inflation, hyperinflation. We're going to talk about the diversity of the economy, some of the ideals of the Confederacy. We're going to talk about international relationships, countries, counties, states. So there's a lot to it. And then we're going to have some predictive ideas based on history. Remember, I'm always someone who says, nobody can prognosticate the future, but if you look at the past and trends, the trend is your friend. Often there are parallels. And in this case, the Russian ruble and the Confederate dollar, there's a lot of interesting parallels. The first striking parallel is they're both mercantilist economies. It's very hard to stamp out the fire of these mercantilism ideas that if you have an export-driven economy, even if it's a one commodity shop, cotton in the South, or in the case of Russia, it's oil and gas, you still have money or gold coming in, and you're accumulating this. This was a mercantilist idea. And in my last video, I started to discuss how Adam Smith contradicts this, and in subsequent videos, perhaps I'll go into more depth. Now, the relevance to monetary devaluation is this. When you're a one commodity shop, if you're an export-driven economy, if you have the resource curse, the Dutch disease, like Russia has and the Confederate economy had, then your viability of your currency is very valuable. If you're not a one shop, if you have a diverse economy like the North had at the time, or the United States or the EU, this currency is not as relevant because currency ultimately is just a cipher, a shadow, a veil to help and facilitate transactions. It's a medium of exchange. If you take this down to an individual level, you consider somebody like me. I live in Europe and I live in America. Okay, so I teach economics. I can teach chess and coach chess. I teach languages. I actually grow, if you know that. I'm a grower. I investment accountant. Oh, and I'm a YouTuber. So even though I don't have a lot in my bank account, I have a lot of skills that are transferable, and I'm not too worried about it. And I don't even care if I'm holding zloty, euro, or dollar. And that's, a rebuttal against, BRICS is coming and dollar replacement. But if you're a one-shop stop and all you're doing is accumulating rubles, then if that currency goes down and that's your bank account, that's your treasure, that's your wealth, that's what you put your worldly ambitions on, then if that value goes down, you're basically worthless. You got it? So yes, the US dollar could be replaced. Euro could be replaced, but it's not as big an impact if you're just a one-stop mercantilist exporting oil and gas. Let's go back to the Civil War. 1861, like 2022, both the ruble and the Jonny Reb currency went up. There was initial euphoria. And if I stumble on my words, it's very cold out here. It's like freezing, Floridian, not used to it. So initially, the ruble went up and the grayback went up. The Confederate currency went up, but they both went into a spiral, a downward decline. 1863, the currency was again, in terms of technical trading, in both and in 2024 hitting resistance. And so what you did see was greater spread, lower volume, and greater volatility, both with the ruble and the Confederate currency. But 1863, tell me about 1863. What do you know? The South enjoyed victory after victory in the South. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Winchester, June of 1863. And they started their northward hoe to this town you maybe never even heard of, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What were they doing? They were looking for shoes and supplies. And they were not looters like the Russians. They actually wanted to pay with Confederate currency, 4:30 in the morning. They didn't mean to engage, but the 8th Illinois Cavalry engaged the Confederates outside around Gettysburg in a skirmish. Jeb Stuart, he was kind of lost somewhere. He was the eyes and ears of General Lee's army, and so they didn't expect it. Lieutenant Marcel Jones of the 8th Illinois Cavalry was the first casualty of that battle. And you know how that went. But 1863 in July was known as the high watermark of the Confederacy, even though in Vicksburg, July 4th, Vicksburg fell, and that was a crucial blow in terms of this Mississippi. But in the East Coast, they were holding their own and even invading the North. So you could say that was the high watermark of the Confederacy. And similarly, we see Russian gains that continuously depress into Ukraine. Those land gains mean nothing compared to the economics behind it, because the Civil War, like this war, is an economic war. It's a war of attrition, not necessarily on soldiers, unfortunately, but economics. The South and the Russians had great shortages, okay? And they didn't have, since the South was bent on this export-driven economy like the Russians are, they didn't have the manufacturing diversified base. New Orleans fell in 1862, and Savannah became the hub of the cotton trade. But the Northern sanctions started to tighten. After the Second Battle of Bull Run, the French and the British decided they didn't see any great, hope for the South, in maybe not, but they decided to stay quasi-neutral. So this cotton, their export was being squeezed. Yes, just like Russia is, there's ways around it, and they were getting around this blockades. But that was not the point. Shortages started to appear. Inflation started to appear. That's what's happening in Russia. You don't hear about it. The Jonny Reb dollar, or the grayback, it lost 300% of its value from the beginning. Now, if you take the beginning of the ruble and the same timeline, parallel timeline, 2022 to 2024, most conservative estimate, if you take real value and consider the spread, it's lost 100%, 150% of the value, and less conservative estimates, 300% of the value. So if this is the high watermark of the Confederacy, 1863, and the parallel universe, 2024, of the Russian advances with 300%, let's say, in the real nominal terms, and I'm talking spread, you try to buy ruble on the market, black market, you're going to see that 300% denomination, a devaluation. Those are two parallels in history you can't ignore. What happened in 1863 after the fall of Vicksburg, after the Battle of Gettysburg? These geopolitical events did not yet impact the fall of the Confederate dollar. Just like I don't expect to see the fall of the ruble significantly until 2025. I initially said 2026, but the way it looks like it's accelerating. Now, the Confederacy still maintained, even the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania campaign, late 1864, the Confederacy still didn't lose a lot of land. Richmond was still holding. The Confederate Army under Lee, with amazing tactics and strategies. He was a brilliant tactician. I think he graduated second in his class at West Point, won over in mathematics. He was able to hold back a much larger army. Now, the Russians, they don't have the same generals. There's nothing like the South in that regard. And again, I'm not talking about freedom. I'm not talking about moral judgments here, because that's another conversation. Although you could make a parallel. that the Russian serfdom is an extension into this oligarchy that it has today, and the Russians are living in a quasi-serfdom environment. I mean, 10%, what do you think? 1% are oligarchs in Russia? And in the Confederacy, remember, only 10% of the people were landowners in plantation, maybe at max, maybe even 5% or 1% of these large plantations. So there's a similar stratification, and that's often a symptom of this resource curse, this mercantilism, this export-driven economy. So 1864, the currency had not fallen. Now, what else is parallel? It had fallen, but it was 1864. It was not just totally worthless. Well, international recognition, nobody really except, bad players and bad actors recognize the Russian Federation at this point. And similarly with the Confederacy, towards the end of the war, it was losing international recognition. As the sanctions, blockades, whatever you call it, and people can raise their hands, they don't work, and there's ways around it, they do work. It just takes years. Look at the Civil War. Late 1864, the Confederate Army was still able to field an army, a viable army. It was only in 1865 did this all start to fall apart, and it didn't fall apart because of the battle worthiness. Lee had this plan to link up with Johnson in North Carolina, and that could have been at a significant force if they were able to do that. Richmond fell April 2nd, April 3rd. Battle of, in Appomattox Courthouse, I believe it was the 11th, April 11th, 11th, 12th. So the currency actually was starting to fall before that, early in 1865. And my initial projections of the Russian ruble falling early 2026 and then the whole system collapsing later, I may have to upscale that a little bit, but if we see this as a parallel history, let's watch and see how this plays out. What are the symptoms? Obviously hyperinflation. And alternative currencies started to arise. In the Civil War, they started to take Mexican peso, Spanish pieces of 8, Great British pound, and the French franc in the South. In Russia, the number one alternative currency is the US dollar. You can take that, Mr. Czar of Russia. And then number 2 is the euro. And they're messing with cryptocurrency, and everybody's like fleeing into crypto. And both the South and Russia are starting to use barter exchange ratios, or at least proxies for barter exchange in whatever can be taken. So there's more parallels. And when this hits at the end in 1865, people, both the North and the South, they were using Confederate currency as monopoly money. They were just kind of gambling with it and just play money, burning it and having fun. And I burned some ruble. Maybe I'll do a special on the ruble I have in my pocket. This thing. Maybe I'll do a special for various reasons. I don't know if you can see it. It's a real, has security threads, has a picture of Moscow. Might be nice to burn. So the South lost because of resources, not because of anything that happened on the front line. Remember that. In the parallel universe, it was hitting the high watermark, just like you can make an argument the Russians are on the front line. It happened because shortages started to appear, hyperinflation started to appear. It was driven by a one commodity, one shop commodity economy, mercantilism, which is never stable. And you can parallel the technicals. If you look at the technical charts, they almost are exact mirrors. I should plug in the charts of the volatility, the resistance, and intraday trading. The ruble and the Confederate currency almost parallel each other. Certainly the devaluation. So if we were to make a statement that the Russian ruble is paralleling the Confederate currency, I think that's very good news for Ukraine, because Russia is not connected to the markets. They don't have this manufacturing capability. They don't have the sophisticated dirt roads in Russia, dirt roads in the Confederacy. If you've ever been to Russia, much of it is unimproved roads, horse and wagon, trains. Everything is rail in Russia. Everything was rail in the Confederacy. It's going down, Russia. It's going to be much worse than the Confederacy. And I hope that they have these occupation zones or whatever, splinters. I mean, Georgia is trying to rebel against Russia's grip, right? The state of Georgia in the South tried to actually succeed from the Confederacy. I have so many uncanny parallels. And if you're a Civil War buff, you can put it down. Here's another one. The U.S. lost 622,511 men at the conservative estimate in the Civil War. And the Russians have already exceeded that at 720. The U.S. lost more than if you combine all the other wars combined in the U.S. WW2, the biggie, 300 and I think 10,000 battle casualties, maybe up to 400K in total casualties. But still, the Civil War will exceed that if you aggregate all the other battles and wars that the U.S. fought. So that's how massive, and it's insane to think that this still can happen in 2024. They are out of resources. And the Confederacy, when they were proclaiming the high watermark, Pickett's charge, July 3rd, 2 in the afternoon, I believe, 1863, that's what seems to be being proclaimed in Russia right now. So let's just watch this all unfold. It will begin with the devaluation of the Russian ruble. And just as it happened with the Russian currency, the Confederate currency. Confederate currency is worthless. And the Russian Federation will be just a footnote in history for future historians to joke about, laugh about, or cast moral judgment on. Let's watch this currency devalue. My name is Mark Biernot. I'm a monetary economist. Have a great day. Thank you very much. GoPro, stop recording.